today's webinar on virtual fencing, lessons from a Victorian trial. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung, the local custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the lands on which you are joining us from, and also wish to acknowledge any First Nations people that may be joining us or watching this webinar. I'd like to introduce Meaghan, and Meaghan did a study in with Halter, virtual fencing, and I'll hand it over to her to do her presentation. Thanks very much for joining us, Meaghan.
No worries. Thanks, Jason. I'll just bring the presentation up.
And while that's happening, use the chat feature if you would like to ask a question throughout. We'll answer questions towards the end, but if there's multiple questions at the time, we'll interrupt Meaghan and ask those questions then. But we'll type your answers into the chat. Over to you, Meaghan.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. So essentially what I'm going to be doing today is giving you a bit of an overview about the Halter technology, but then talking about the demonstration that we did here at Ellinbank last year. So it's not a typical research experiment or trial like we normally do at Ellinbank. The purpose of us getting the technology on farm was as a demonstration, so we could have farmers, service providers, and just a number of key people out onto the farm, which I'll talk on a little bit more in the coming slides. So first of all, I should just really say that I work for Agriculture Victoria, so obviously work for the government. I'm not here endorsing Halter and saying Halter is the only company that you should go with if you decide to get virtual fencing on farm, but I'm just here to talk about the experience that we had with Halter. There are obviously, of course, other companies, but our demonstration was with their company, Halter, and so that's the experience that I'll be talking about today. As well as that, Jason and I were actually talking a little bit earlier today about the regulations. So a few of you might have heard that back in May, the Agricultural Minister, Minister Spence, announced that by the end of the year, they were changing the regulations to allow commercial farmers to have virtual fencing on farm. Currently, we're only allowed to have it on research facilities with an animal ethics approval. We don't have it here at Ellinbank at the moment. We are waiting for those regulations to change before we re-implement Halter or another company on farm. But I will admit we have had some really great discussions with Halter and would like to reinstate that tech. So Halter itself is a company, if people are not quite don't know that much about Halter. It was founded in New Zealand a few years ago. Last numbers that I've heard is they have about 300,000 cows with Halter collars on, mainly in New Zealand. They have come over here to Australia, but most of them are in Tasmania and Queensland in beef, and they've also expanded into the US. But I also imagine that once the regulations change both here and in New South Wales and South Australia, that number is going to increase quite a bit as well. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about virtual fencing with dairy cattle. I understand that there's also a lot of beef farmers that might be online. The technology it works the same for beef and dairy. Obviously, you have to think about how you manage your farm, your pastures, how you want to use the tech. But how the technology actually works is going to be transferable to beef as well. And Halter have, whilst most of their cows that they manage are dairy, they have moved into the beef space as well. So just to start, a little bit of general information about Halter itself. So Halter uses solar-powered cow collars, and I'll show you an image of that on the next slide, towers, and an app to virtually fence and virtually herd their cows. And I apologise, the lights have just gone off in this room, so it's probably a little bit dark. What the technology does is monitor cow health. Reproduction falls into that bucket as well, and also pasture growth. Now, the technology itself operates by using cues to manage the cows. So there's two primary cues. The first is sound, and that is what's going to hold the cows within the break in the paddock or send them in the correct direction. The second primary cue is vibration. So in the little diagram that you can see on this slide, on the right-hand side, what it's showing is that there is a cow in that kind of plot of grass on the left-hand side. If she approaches that dotted line, that shows, where the end of her break is. Once she gets to that line and goes across it, she'll start to receive a sound cue that tells her that she's crossed the boundary. So if she gets a sound cue out of the right ear, it's telling her the fence is on the right side and she needs to turn left, and vice versa. The vibration cue is what tells the cows that it's time to move, whether that's to leave the paddock to go to the dairy for milking, or if they are doing a break-to-break shift. So if they were moving from the area of grass on the left to that on the right. Now, those two can actually work together. So in that top image, it's showing us that the cow is facing away from the gate. In this instance, we've asked the cow to move into the laneway and go to the dairy. Because she's not facing in the correct direction, it's going to use the sound cue to turn her around into what Halter call their forward angle, which is that 90-degree angle that faces towards the gate. And once she gets into that, she'll get the vibration cue that tells her that it's time to move. The secondary cue that the Halter collars will provide is a low energy impulse. Now, it's a low energy impulse because it's 1/100th of what a cow would experience if they touch a typical electrical fence. That's because, one, it's not rounded like it is if they touch a fence. The collar itself has the ability to just isolate that low energy impulse just on the neck of the cows. With that as well, the cows actually don't really need that much of an impulse for them to kind of get that reinforcement that the low energy impulse is telling them that they've done the wrong thing. So they don't need much of an impulse to reinforce that behaviour, which is why it is as low as it is. Here is a picture of the collar itself. It's got two solar panels on either side. It does have a flashing light which will flash when the cows are on heat. You can also use that to if you need to go and look for a cow in a paddock, you can select a function that will turn the light on and it's able to do that. What happens with the collars is that after the training period, which I will talk about briefly, the collars learn each individual cow. So it knows her usual activity, her usual behaviour, which of course is going to help for any health alerts she might have when she's on heat. But it also is going to know how many pulses that she requires to reinforce her behaviour. So I went over to New Zealand last year, visited a farmer, and he had a herd of 580 cows. He said that most of his cows are what he calls model citizens. So they figure out where the boundary is and they just respect that. You're always going to have those few that like to push the boundaries a little bit. So those girls are going to maybe need a few more impulses, more than the model citizens who are just happy in their area once they figure out where that is. The next part of the technology as a whole is the towers that they put on farm. So this image here is, a screenshot of what the farm at Ellinbank looks like. In these little boxes here, you can see where we've got towers. So we've got 2 Wi-Fi towers and then these 3 base stations over here, one including over at our lease block across the road. So when we decided to get Halter here on farm, Halter comes out and drone maps the farm. And that helps them determine, one, how many towers we need, but it also helps them map where all the paddocks are, where all the laneways are, the buildings, etc., which is obviously going to help you to manage the cows using the technology. Now, I do have a couple of notes here up on the right-hand side. If for some reason the towers or the connection goes down, the cows can still be managed virtually. So they'll either be held in their break for 2 hours or until a scheduled break is due to occur. And you can actually schedule moves to the dairy or break to break shifts. If you do lose power, and we did have this last year, we had a pretty intense windstorm go through Gippsland, knocked out the power for about 4 days. We could still manage the cows using the Halter technology. You just needed someone who could get internet access on their phone. So what that meant for quite a few of the dairy staff was they'd have to drive up to the top office. We didn't necessarily have office internet up here, but they could get a signal on their phone to use the internet and then to move the cows. In some instances, if they couldn't, there was a few days where I was at home and they were able to contact me and say, hey, can you move the cows either break to break shift or to the dairy? So it still does work if you lose power. It's just really important to still maintain that internet connectivity. The other note on there is that if the app does go down, and we did have one instance of that during the time we had the demonstration, the Halter team will be in contact with you and help you with manual management. There's a huge amount of support that you get from the team, both on the app and then I'm sure once the regulations change and Halter move into Victoria, they'll have plenty of staff on the ground that can also provide assistance if you need it. So here's just a couple of snapshots of the app itself, and I'm just going to point out a couple of key things. So on the images on the left and the right hand side, you can see a couple of, I suppose, not functions, but a couple of different tabs within the app, I suppose you could call them. So the first one is herd, and that's where you can have your cows in different groups, different mobs as they call them. You can look at their cow card, you could say, and then look on their health and heat, their grazing behaviour, etc. The second one, Insights, is a whole tab that gives you an overview of the pasture on your farm. So I won't go into too much detail, but Halter use satellite overpasses as well as algorithms within their app. And you can even go out and take residual photos using your phone to figure out how much pasture is available on the farm. So you can get all of that in Insights. In Live, you can obviously see the map of where your cows exactly are at that time. So you can see them in a couple of paddocks here and here, and then on their way to the dairy. In allocation, you can look at the amount of feed that you're providing the cows. You can even put in, for dairy farmers, a grain ration, any conserved fodder that you might be feeding the cows, and it'll tell you if you're meeting their targets for those days. So you can also see up the top there's a little bar, and some of these days are when we were initially starting in a training period, so we weren't too worried about their allocations at that time, which is why they look so high. But it'll tell you, especially in this one on the right hand side, how much area you've allocated the cows, and how that fits into how much feed they're going to get that day and if you're meeting their targets. When we first got the Halter technology on farm, and for any commercial farmers, they'll have to go through a training period as well. Ours was a 14-day training period. So we used safety fences and humans were still interacting with the cows. There was still a little bit of manual management, but they declined over time because the cows obviously begin to learn what the cues mean. So the image here shows there's a little white peg that you can kind of see on the right-hand side. That's where our virtual fence was set on our very first break, very first virtual break. And then on the left-hand side of the image, you can kind of see a strip wire fence there. So that strip wire fence was 7 metres in front of the cows. And what it means is that when they first step into that area where they shouldn't be, they're going to start getting those sound cues, which is telling them to turn around and go back. They have to associate that with what they're used to, which is the physical fence in front of them. So during that first training period, that first day, the cows did experience quite a few of those sound cues to get them to turn around and go back. They still did graze a lot of that safety area in the first break, but what we found was in 24 hours, the amount of pasture that the cows had eaten in that safety area just greatly reduced. With the safety fence, you increase it further and further away over time, but we were actually able to remove it after 3 days because the cows had just learnt that the sound cue said that's where the boundary was and not to go across it. Obviously, during the first day of the training period, the number of those low energy impulses that the cows received was a lot higher than any other day that we've had since. Again, because they are just learning the technology. But it's really important to note that I think most people can probably understand when you've seen a cow touch an electric fence, or when you touch a fence itself, you do vocalize. When the cows receive that low energy impulse using the Halter technology, they don't do that. There might just be like a bit of a jolt. You can tell that they've received that shock, but it's very small compared to touching an electric fence. Also, during the training period, you have to teach the cows to respond to that vibration cue so that they know it's time to move. So on that very first day, we gave them about a minute to experience that before then going and manually herding them out of the paddock. You increase the amount of time that you give them over the next coming days in the training period so that they, you're not stepping in as much. You're really allowing the cows to learn the technology. And we got to a point after 3 or 4 days where you really didn't have to go and get the cows. You would only go if there were some that just weren't interested in moving. But after those few days, the girls really understood the cues. I would say about that 5-day period is when you could get really confident with them knowing exactly what the cues mean. When you use Halter to set up your paddocks and your fencing, there's a few kind of key considerations that we need to make. So cows can be held, as it says here, within a paddock using both an active boundary and an inactive boundary, which is, where a physical fence is. So on the image on the right-hand side, if it's a solid white line, that's an active edge. If it's a dotted line, that's an inactive edge. So that means that the cows can graze right up to your already existing physical fence, which is great. What you can also see down here is that there's a gate buffer. So that means that you can keep the gates open. So if you're a dairy farmer, you don't have to lock the cows in. You've got that gate buffer and it's far enough away from the actual gate where the cows will get the cues if they cross that and then turn around and go back into their break. The really key thing to consider, though, when you are setting up your laneways and your paddocks is that you still need to go into the laneway and physically set up any tapes or block off a different laneway that the cows are going to so that they can accurately get to and from the paddock. Now, it is interesting when you set up the breaks within the Halter app. It will tell you if you've allocated enough area per cow, if there's enough room for all of the cows there. But you also have to be very considerate of how you set that up as well. So we've just got, a couple of like square shapes here. Halter says that you can set up, what they call polygons. So there's quite a few number of points that you can put into that fence to make it in pretty much any shape you want. What you do have to consider, though, is you can't make a corner any tighter than 45 degrees, because if a cow gets stuck in there and she's got an active boundary on either side, she's going to get cues out of both ears and then not know which way to turn. Another important thing when you are moving cows, say for a break-to-break shift within a paddock, this image shows that we've got all of our girls in this one area of the paddock, and then we're going to move them to the next part of the paddock in a few hours. So I think for those on the call online that are either on farm or have experienced farms, if you go out there and you've got a strip wire fence in front of them, you take the fence down and all the cows run to the corner where you've first taken the fence down to get into the new break. What Halter does is it just directs all the cows to the closest point of the new break, wherever they're standing when you ask them to move. So all the cows at this bottom end will just move straight across or be directed straight across the line there. All these cows up here will be directed straight across the line at the other end, which is really great. For a cow to activate the paddock, she has to be at least 6 meters from each fence for at least 10 seconds. So these girls in here, they've activated the brake, which means that if they approach an active fence or once they cross it, they'll get that sound cue, and then same thing here at the gate buffer so they can't get out. There are 2 cows here down the bottom that haven't reached the paddock yet, which means they haven't activated the brake for themselves. So each individual cow will activate the brake for herself. Since I actually put these slides together, Halter have actually brought out a function where you can not only use virtual fencing to herd the cows from the paddock to the dairy, as an example for dairy farmers, but now you can also use the technology to herd the cows from the dairy back to the paddock. So if they decide to stop in the laneway, it will give them a vibration cue to encourage them to keep moving. We weren't doing that at the time of our demonstration. So these 2 cows here, because they hadn't activated the brake, if they wanted to just hang around in the laneway for a little bit, they could, but they generally kept walking to the paddock. So that's really important because if, for example, we had a sick herd here at Ellinbank, it meant that we didn't need to pause the collars. We just had to make sure that we didn't draw any active boundaries in the paddock that those sick cows were in, especially if they were mixing with other cows in the herd that didn't have the technology on them. Halter takes a real active, proactive approach to animal welfare, and they really want to make sure that no cow is negatively impacted. So there's a number of different features that will allow the collars to disable if they need to. You can also get a number of different notifications. So if a cow's left behind in the paddock, it will send us a notification to alert the staff, and then you can go and check for that cow. If you also have a change in the cow's behaviour that might indicate that she's unwell, you'll get a notification. They also have notifications for a cow if a cow's on heat, which are great, except when you receive them at 2 o'clock in the morning. But in terms of the devices actually disabling, as I said before, the cows will know each individual cow. Sorry, the collars will know each individual cow after 14 days. It knows how many impulses she needs to receive. So as an example, if a cow only ever needs 1 impulse to reinforce her behaviour, if she ever receives 2, the collar will immediately disable and send us a notification. And this is really important in case a cow has, say, gone down in the paddock and she can't move despite the number of cues she might be getting. The second example of the safety features are if you have an obstacle blocking the path of the cows, the collars are also going to disable and send you a notification once 10% of the herd has stopped. So we had an instance last year where here at Ellinbank, we have lots of different herds and experiment herds, especially this time of the year in spring. We had an experiment herd walking past a laneway where the halter cows were going to be coming up. So the halter cows were stopped at a tape. The experiment herd just wasn't up in time for that staff member to change the tape, and we got a notification to say that something was blocking the cows because 10% of the herd had stopped, and it recognised that it couldn't move the whole herd of cows. So it stopped giving them any impulses or reminders to move along. If that happens, you can only unpause the collars if you go and check that there's nothing in the way, like a tree or the tape, etc. And finally, and this is not the only safety feature, I'm just giving a few examples. If the cows are spooked and bolt, whether that's, they're spooked by dogs or a storm, etc., the collars are going to be able to detect that the whole herd is moving at a speed that's greater than normal. So it's going to disable, let the cows run. Hopefully there's some physical fences around that's going to stop them. But then once they've all calmed down, it's going to gradually move the cows back to their assigned brake using those sound and those vibration cues. So again, they have a real focus on animal welfare. So a little bit about the demonstration at Ellinbank. We had 181 cows in the demonstration last year. They were a mix of our first lactation cows and our older carryover cows. The reason we chose those animals was our first lactation cows are typically not included in any research unless we're specifically looking at something that might occur as first covers. And the same thing for our carryovers as well. We collared the animals in late August after they had calved. So we don't have any experience with using the technology over a calving period at the moment. And our first virtual break was at the end of August. As I mentioned earlier, we had a 14-day training period, and we had an R&D specialist from Halter actually come over to Ellinbank to help us with that. Halter do have a number of training courses online that they send out to staff once you register with Halter and once you've got the devices on the farm, so that you can understand how you're going to be training the cows. They don't always send a specialist out to help people train the animals, but it is still it was really helpful for us. And if you have any questions, you can always, jump onto the support function of the app and get some help there. We didn't only just have to train the cows to use Halter. We had a number of key staff that had to be trained how to use the Halter app. So how you set up virtual breaks, making sure the fences are appropriate. How do you virtually herd the cows? If you go into the app and you're moving animals, you have to go through a number of different steps of where do you want to move them, what laneways, etc., if that's where you're going. And then you finally get to a section where it says, yep, this is it, and we're about to move the cows. So we had to learn how to do that. And obviously learn how to understand the heat and the health notifications. Halter now have a web application as well. So, we were able to use that in particular down on the dairy computer for the heat activity. But the only way you can move the cows is via the app. I will say as well that there is absolutely no way that you can select to give a cow a impulse through the app. So it will only be received from the collar if the cow has ignored any of the previous cues or is doing the wrong thing. So that's, I suppose, another safety feature as well. As I mentioned, the work that we did here at Ellinbank wasn't a research trial in particular. We have spoken to Halter about the potential for us to do some research with their technology in coming years, but it was mainly so that we could get people out to Ellinbank to visit and see the technology in action. I think it's really great to attend webinars or to read about Halter itself, but actually seeing it in person is it just reinforces everything you've heard about it, and I think that's just a completely different experience. It was really great that we were able to get the Victorian Agriculture Minister and a number of key bodies like the UDV, the VFF, Dairy Australia, and the RSPCA out here to actually see the technology working. And I would like to think that, being able to see the tech maybe helped with the decision to change those regulations. With our demonstration, we managed the cows as a single herd. And what we implemented was obviously active breaks most days in front of the cows with the gate buffers, but also what we called our break-to-break shifts. So every morning we would give the cows 50% of their day allocation up to 11 a.m. And then at 11 a.m. we would give them a break-to-break shift into that next area of the paddock. What we also started to do was transition to paddock shifts. So particularly at this time of year when we're cutting silage, you like to send your cows into the paddock after it's been cut and, they clean up the edges. We were able to do that, send a Halter girls in there for an hour and a half. And then as long as all the laneways are set, we were able to easily move them to a new paddock with a click of a button, no staff member sitting behind the cows moving them. We also did monitor the daily milk yield of the cows as well. And this graph shows just kind of a snapshot of how their milk yields were tracking around the training period. So the red arrow is the very first day we had the virtual break. Doesn't really look like anything happened there. We did lose about 1 litre per cow in milk production, but they got it back straight away. So in terms of any impacts of the technology on milk production at that time, I'd say were really, really minimal. And there wasn't an impact after the training period where we had, say, sustained low milk production. As I said, the girls bounced back really, really well from that tech. from the training period. So there's just a few photos here that I'd like to show. I've got a video in a couple of slides as well. You can see that the collars here on the cows. For the dairy collars, the way the buckle is set up is that it has two prongs, so that it's quite not so much snug on the cows, but it's less likely to come off. They've got a different kind of setup for the collars for beef farmers, because obviously as your cows grow, you're going to need to adjust them. I really like this photo. This is one of our favourite cows, Ricky. This is 2 days in. She had smashed the solar panel already after 2 days. I don't know how, but and I'm not an engineer, so I don't know the full details of it, but the solar panels do have a protective coating over it. So even though the panel itself was smashed, it was still functional, and the water wasn't going to get in there to wreck the collar. But if any collars do play out, you'll get a notification on the Halter app to tell you that. This second image, or the image on the right hand side, I really like because it gives you an example of the GPS drift. So the GPS location of the cows, which is shown by the dots, and the different colours are our two different herds that were obviously managed within that group, that first lactation and the carryover cows. You can see that some of these dots look like they're in the car park. You have about a 1 metre accuracy with the location of the cows using the app, but there also is potential for GPS drift. It happens most frequently during storms, but it does happen in other instances there, and you can look at that and think that the cows are out, but they're actually not. Just again, the photos probably don't do justice. To see it in person is really great, but you can kind of see here that there's that active front edge that the cows aren't walking over. Same here with the images down the bottom. You can kind of see where the cows have got the grazed pasture and then the pasture in front of them. Just to see the cows without a physical fence in front of them it's really, really impressive. And these are a couple of images of our post break to break shift. Again, those top two images were taken in spring, so you can see that really clear defined line between the two different breaks. But the image on the bottom right hand side is how we use the tech in summer. So even though there was silage on both sides of the break, the cows still respected the technology and knew they couldn't go over there. And that's an image after the cows have been moved. So this was a paddock that had a little bit of chicory in it, but most of it was silage for the cows. So it still does work during the summer periods where there's no grass or very minimal grass to graze. This is a video that I'll just show you here, and it does go for a couple of minutes, but I'll just talk to it while it's going. You can see here the cows have started to move, so they've obviously got the cues to tell them that it's time to move to the next break in the paddock. They've got a rectangular area down here. Don't worry about these cows, they're in a different herd in a different paddock, so they're not getting the cues. But the Halter cows, we want them to move up here to this area, kind of obstructed by the trees from the view. There's no fence, no physical fence along this side or in front of the cows, and that's actually quite a big paddock, and I think we ended up splitting that paddock into 4 to feed the cows. So you can see that initial movement by the cows. It is interesting as well, we had 2 cows within the herd that were always the ones that kind of led the girls across a break. You have those natural leaders in the herd. The cows moved. These girls here at the back, because they're facing in the correct direction, they've gotten the vibration cue. These girls here that are facing the wrong way won't have got the vibration cue, but you get to a point where the cows are herded, and so if they see animals moving in one direction, they're most likely going to follow them. But why I really like this video is that for some reason the girls have thought, oh yeah, okay, this is where we're going to move to over here. And as we progress a little bit more through the video, we're probably halfway through now, what we'll see is the girls start to move across that break, but they're actually moving in the wrong direction. But the technology itself is going to correct that. So you can see here, these first lot of girls have started to move across the brake in the wrong direction, but then in a second you'll see them start to turn around into and move up towards the correct brake that they need to go in. Again, these girls are probably just following the herd mentality, but now you can see them all realize that they're going in the wrong direction and starting to move to the correct brake. It's things like that that just really, in my opinion, really fantastic to watch. To see it in person again is just it's really great. But just how easy is that to move the cows? I was there filming that, but we essentially could have just sat in the dairy office and moved the cows that way as well, which after a while the dairy staff could just do. Just a final slide, just to summarize what we talked about, but just point out a couple of things to consider. We did have the 14-day training period, but Halter suggests that you can continue to add cows to the herd, and they will most likely learn what the technology means off the other cows, even though they will start the 14-day training period. But if you're adding more than 20% of the herd size, then the training program needs to be started again with all the cows. Here at Ellinbank, we have all-flex activity meters on the main herd. When we started using the Halter technology, we did take those collars off and then just use Halter for both virtual fencing and the heat and health monitoring. I have heard of commercial farmers that decide to keep 2 collars on. They use all-flex for their heat and health, as an example, and Halter for the virtual fencing. In terms of paddock layout, trough locations is something that needs to be considered. How you draw the brakes. Here at Ellinbank, we've got lots of smaller paddocks. It's great for research. Again, trough location is really important when you draw a brake. And in some instances, when we moved cows in the brake-to-brake shift, there wasn't a trough in the next brake. But you can still back fence the area that they've already grazed and just set up a small virtual laneway down towards a trough. So it's got really, really great applications there. As well as that, we here at Ellinbank hadn't implemented brake-to-brake shifts with our main herd in the past. So it took a little bit longer for the girls to learn that because it was out of the norm. But they did definitely get there in the end. And it was something that might have taken a couple of weeks. And we just needed people to step in and help them as they learned. Another thing as well that I should mention is Halter talk about the ability for the devices to go on animals from about that 12 months of age. From what I understand, it does take a little bit longer for the animals of that age to learn what the technology is asking them to do, but they definitely get there in the end. Maybe a couple of weeks longer than it would take for mature cows. But again, when I went to New Zealand last year, seeing a herd of rising 2-year-olds managed in a paddock behind a virtual brake with the gate wide open was really, really impressive to see. So I'm going to wrap up the presentation there. Jason, if anyone has questions, I would be more than happy to answer those.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions, Meaghan. So the first one is there or will there be technology available that eliminates the need for towers?
That's a very good question, and unfortunately one I can't answer. That might be a question for a Halter representative or someone who works in the virtual fencing kind of space. I suppose for myself, I'm research, so kind of less of that. I don't have any engineering experience. So, hey, potentially in the future.
The collar cost and then the ongoing costs.
So I can give people a bit of a ballpark. From what I understand, you're looking at about $10 to $16 per cow per month for the collars. That's based on what kind of information you want to get out of the app and like how many towers do you need on farm. There's 5 here at Ellinbank, but after speaking to the Halter reps, some farms only need 1. So for farmers to get an accurate estimate of how much the cost would be, they'd really need to get in touch with the Halter rep and talk about, their farm, how many cows they have. That's a ballpark, but, might not
So
be.
would it be to do with undulation and distances that will impact the number of towers on?
I'm not sure about distance. So definitely not undulation. If anyone online's been to Ellinbank before, it's quite undulating here, but 20 or 30 years ago, we had someone plant a lot of trees as well. So, there's that line of sight that we kind of had to worry about, which is why we've got a couple of Wi-Fi towers. We've got a lot of trees blocking line of sight. So,
another question. You referenced the need to still have some internal fences. Is that just for the milking horde, or would that be the case for a beef operation, do you think?
I think it would probably be for both. The dairy farmer I spoke to in New Zealand, he went from 150 paddocks down to 60. He could just make those paddocks bigger and manage them better using the virtual fencing tech. You would obviously want that outer boundary fence on your farm, but the number of physical fences that you might need internally could be drastically reduced. I probably can't answer too specifically, because for all the people online, everyone's farm's different. So, you might have one farmer that might be able to halve the number of paddocks, and another one that, take out a lot of internal fences, and another person that might not be able to.
There's sort of a question again following up on towers that we've sort of can't answer, but how many mobs can you have?
To be honest, I don't think there's a limit to the number of mobs you can have. We ran the cows as one herd, but there was 2 mobs within those. When you look at mobs, if you are running, say, 3 different mobs themselves in the one paddock, you can't individually select either a mob or a cow to just bring them out of the paddock or move them a break to break shift. You'd be doing all the mobs in that paddock. So you could probably have multiple mobs, but if you're running them all together in the same paddock, you're managing them just as one.
So what you've seen is that the rising 2-year-olds will run as a mob, because obviously they're not being milked, but the farmer had other mobs that they were obviously using at the milking herd as well. They're grazing different paddocks at different times, and that was achievable. Yeah,
it was achievable for sure.
Have you or others used the technology for intensive grazing of forage crops? So you talked about the technology able to sort of start to get an idea of how much feed's in the paddock with forage crops. Is that also achievable?
I think that would be achievable. We didn't personally do it at Ellinbank, but you can indicate what kind of, not specifically which crop you've got in that paddock, but you can highlight if it's a crop or if it's a pasture, or if you're, cutting it for silage within the app itself. So I imagine that with a forage crop, you would be able to manage it exactly the same way.
Yeah. And Adam's can you use the towers for other devices? So if you've got a black spot in your mobile data on your farm, can you use the towers for that, or is it specific for the technology that you're using?
The Halter towers are specific for the Halter technology. Yeah, you can't use them for other purposes.
And is there similar research for beef cattle going on that you are aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, but I would have no doubt that they are doing some research with beef cattle, maybe not with the Halter technology, maybe with a different virtual fencing product. But I imagine that there would be. I probably focus quite a bit on dairy cows, so not entirely sure what their research would be looking into, but I imagine that there is.
Well, thank you for everyone joining us today. We'll now have a offline question and answer session, but thank you for joining us, and we'll now stop the recording and catch you at another event soon.